Okay, we are covering a heavy topic today. So let's talk about suicide and some suicide statistics and how we manage suicide clinically and how we intervene to try to prevent suicide for individuals. Okay, so let me go ahead and get this started. And let's start by talking a little bit about language and how language has evolved and how professionals treat this term now. We used to say that an individual, when they died of suicide, they committed suicide. And nowadays we're trying to move away from that language. I know I'm having to work pretty hard myself to kind of correct myself on that. The reason why we don't say committed suicide is that it makes it sound like you've committed some type of crime. And suicide in most states is no longer an illegal act. It also suggests that it's a rational act. And for a lot of individuals who end up dying of suicide, it is not at all a rational act. And so we prefer the term died by suicide nowadays. Okay. Okay, so let's get some language down. So suicide is the act or instance of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally. And when a person's just thinking about it or having ideas or ideation, we call that suicidal ideation. And that would be the mental consideration of suicide. A suicide plan, if when we are doing a clinical interview, if an individual, particularly if they have a history of depression or have been very, very distressed, we always move into interviewing them and questioning them about possible suicide. If they have suicidal ideation, then we go and we ask them about their suicide plan. So have they made any decisions about when they would do this, where they would enact this? Have they engaged in any preparation? And or do they have a means? So a person with a very clear suicide plan would say, yes, I intend to do this tomorrow at 5 o'clock. I have a loaded handgun and I plan to do this in my apartment bedroom. So that would be a very specific plan. And then we ask if they have made any suicide attempts. And keep in mind that we separate, as clinicians, we separate self-harmful behavior. As an example might be taking a razor blade and cutting one's arm for some type of relief, some kind of psychological relief to feel physical pain so that they're not feeling mental pain. But it's only self-harm with intent to die that we would consider to be suicidal planning or suicide attempting. Okay. So we separate the self-harm from that. So not all self-harm is a suicide attempt. I know I've worked with some teenagers and some families in the past where I've got a teenage client who's maybe doing some cutting behavior and the parents are horrified that they think that their kid has been making suicide attempts. When once I get in there, in some situations, it's not at all an intent to die. It's just a unhealthy coping strategy. Okay, so any questions about any of these definitions here? Okay, I'm not going to do the survey. Let's talk about some statistics. And we're in a really interesting region when it comes to learning about suicide. So suicide is the 10th leading cause of death for people in the United States. It's the second leading cause of death in individuals 15 to 34, so young people. Number one cause of death for young people is accidents, usually motor vehicle accidents. Okay, so suicide is second. It's the third leading cause of death for even younger individuals, ages 10 to 14. In North Carolina, we have twice the died of suicide versus died of homicide or murder. And this was the raw number of deaths last recorded in 2016. But Western North Carolina, out in our region in Appalachia, has higher risk than other regions in North Carolina. And if we know that we estimate that 90% of individuals who die of suicide were suffering from a psychological disorder, and then unfortunately, usually that psychological disorder would have been treatable if that person had been engaging in treatment. Okay. And if we know, and keep in mind, people die of suicide with clinical depression, and people die of suicide with bipolar disorder, people die of suicide with eating disorders. It's not just depression that drives suicide, okay? But knowing that only 20% of people with major depressive episode, clinical depression, only 20% of individuals are being treated. So from a prevention standpoint, what this tells us is that unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who are suffering, but they're suffering alone. They have not hooked up with treatment from a medical doctor or a psychiatrist for medications. They have not hooked up with a counselor, therapist, psychologist for talk therapy. And so from a intervention standpoint, if there's anybody around us, whether it be us or anybody around us who is suffering, oh my gosh, we want to encourage that person to reach out and get professional help. Okay. We also have, let's talk a little bit about this motor vehicle accident kind of situation. You all have probably heard of suicide contagion. And suicide contagion, we had a contagion here several years ago in a fall semester where a young woman went missing, and there was a lot of publicity about her being missing and trying to find her. And then eventually she was discovered she had hung herself in the woods near ASU. And then we had a contagion going on here at ASU where we had more and more suicides of our students after this one particular suicide. You get this kind of phenomenon that happens in high schools where an individual dies publicly, knowledgeable, dies of suicide, and then you get other outbreaks and contagion of suicide. So this contagion effect is a real thing. We even see when a famous person, like a rock star or a famous actor, dies of suicide, we will see increases in suicide at contagion throughout our society. Okay, so we've got that contagion effect. The recording issue here is that, interestingly, most motor vehicle accidents where an individual dies in the motor vehicle accident involves more than one motor vehicle, and it involves multiple people riding in the car. In this situation, we get an interesting kind of phenomenon that happens, and this makes us question how some of these things are recorded, the cause of death. So let's say you've got a person who was a single car crash who died in the car crash. Sometimes that gets recorded as a motor vehicle accident and not recorded as a suicide. Does that make some sense? When there has been a famous case of suicide, we see these single car deaths increase also, which again is kind of some validity to the fact that many of these that are coded as a motor vehicle accident are actually a suicide. Any questions there? I know that sounds a little bit confusing. Okay. Okay, risk factors. We see males are a lot more likely to, when they make a suicide attempt, actually die from the attempt. And you see over here, when we look at age, you see males being much more common in death by suicide than females. Females, on the other hand, make more attempts. So they are 3 times more likely than males to make an attempt, but males are 3.5 times more likely when they attempt to actually die. And does anybody know the difference there? Why is it that women attempt more, but men are more likely to die when they attempt? Anybody want to offer up a possible explanation for that? Men are a lot more likely when they attempt to use a lethal means. And we're going to talk about guns here in a bit, but guns being very lethal. Okay. And women are more likely when they make attempts to use pills. Okay. And you can intervene if you catch someone after they have overdosed on pills, you can intervene and medically, and you can intervene with charcoal and pumping their stomach, that type of thing. A handgun taken particularly to the head is usually going to be lethal. We see age being at risk. You see over here, the risk for young people. And then over 85 years of age, individuals who are veterans, particularly if they're veterans that saw combat and saw death while they were in combat. Geography, we get this really interesting geographical, I'm moving your pictures around here. This really interesting geographical risk where the more rural, and they actually go beyond rural and sometimes we'll call it frontier, the more rural or frontier the region, the more likely we are to see higher suicide rates per capita. Okay. There's even some interesting data on altitude at which people live. Okay. At higher altitudes, we tend to see suicide rates being higher, but then higher altitudes also tends to correlate with being more rural. And then to add to that, rural oftentimes involving households that have guns. Okay, so regionally, when we look at racial differences in suicide, white individuals tend to have the highest rates. After that, it's American Indians or Native Americans. And keep in mind that in many Native American populations, we have very high alcoholism rates, and alcohol certainly can be a contributing factor. After that, Black Americans and Pacific Islanders, and the lowest rates of racial suicide in the US would be from Hispanic, Latinx Americans. Okay. Risk factors, let's take a look at methods here. And again, I want to point out a kind of a unique thing that is going on here in Appalachia and Western North Carolina. So this would be the national data, and over to the right would be the Northwest North Carolina data. So nationally, 51% of suicides are by firearm. For us in our region here, 78% of suicide deaths are firearms. So we have much more firearm suicide death in Western North Carolina, where we're at. Nationally, suffocation is much higher, 24%. So suffocation, this usually involves hanging. And at times it's hanging from a noose from an elevation, but a lot of times individuals will even hang and wrap something and then lean into it to suffocate. Lower rates of suffocation here in Western North Carolina, only 7%. The national and the local levels of overdose or poison are pretty similar. But notably the firearm. Okay, and this is going to come back around when we talk about intervening and trying to prevent suicide here in Western North Carolina. Any questions about that? Okay. When we look at what are called case fatality rates, meaning how lethal are cases, I'm going to move this bar here. With firearms are 85 to 90% fatal when used. It's only 10 to 15% of the time that an individual injures themselves with a firearm but does not die. When it comes to cutting or poisoning, that is rarely fatal. So 98% are non-fatal and can be treated in a hospital emergency department. Okay. So this really gives you a feel for how dangerous, if an individual is suicidal and they intend to plan and use a firearm, much more likely to die than an individual who plans another method. Any questions here? And again, I know that gun ownership is a very political issue here in the United States. Okay. And what I'm trying to do with this data is give you the scientific data. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sensitivity issue of the political issue here when we're intervening. But this is what the science is saying, that people are much more likely to be successful at dying if they're using firearms. Okay. So several of our faculty are experts on this. Dr. Kurt Michael, Dr. J.P. Jameson, they are trainers and do suicide prevention. Before the pandemic, they traveled all over the place and gave workshops and trainings to school personnel, to other clinical psychologists, to counseling centers. They've even done this training with resident advisors here at ASU, and it's called CALM. And it stands for Counseling Against Lethal Means. And there's an interesting phenomenon in individuals when they have suicidal ideation and they start planning for an actual suicide attempt. Individuals will latch onto a method and they tend not to be very flexible and move over to any different method. So as an example, if I were suicidal and I was thinking, well, I would use pills and I would take, let's say I've got a bunch of Tylenol in my medicine chest, I would take the Tylenol. Now, let's say, I don't know, the Tylenol got all used up. You know, somebody else used it. My roommate took my Tylenol, that kind of thing. You would think that a suicidal individual would then start planning a different means. Well, maybe I can get a handgun. Maybe I could figure out how to hang. Maybe I could drive off the parkway that way. Oftentimes individuals, if you take their planned means, their number one planned means, they don't flex and move over to another means, okay? And that, for people who are counseling and trying to intervene and prevent suicide, is a gift to us. Okay, so they tend not to vary. So when we're doing counseling against lethal means, what we do is certainly we want to do a whole suicide assessment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that kind of thing. But we want to take whatever their means is, and we want to distance and secure that means away from them, at least temporarily. Okay, maybe not forever, because a lot of times individuals fear, again, particularly gun owners who pride themselves in being allowed to have their guns, don't want individuals coming in and taking their guns away. Okay, so this is temporarily. Sometimes it takes some persuading of family members to cooperate with this type of thing. But with firearms, what it oftentimes is done is you can always, a sheriff's department, a police department will take and hold guns temporarily. Anytime anybody says, I want to get these guns out of my house, can you secure these guns safely until we're ready to have them back in the home? And again, sheriff, police, they're always willing to do that. But a lot of times what we will do is encourage individuals, if they've got a friend or a relative who could secure their guns, again, temporarily for a while. A lot of times we do that in this region. You know, do you have a neighbor? Do you have a relative who can safely secure and keep the guns out of your house for a while? Other things that we do is help, particularly if you've got, say, a teenager who's suicidal in the home. You will oftentimes have parents remove ammunition from gun, lock up guns, and make sure that the key to the lock is hidden and is secured elsewhere. So sometimes we'll even do things like have parents, I want you to put the handgun and lock it in your glove compartment in your car. Your teenager does not know where it is locked up. You have secured your key and keep your key somewhere where your teenager can't access it, and then keep ammunition somewhere else separate. Okay. Other things that we do, I know they do this. Dr. Michael and Jameson are in 3 of the local high schools, Allegheny, Ash, and Watauga. And they will oftentimes, when they are dealing with a suicidal teenager, will give lock boxes to parents. And parents can either lock their guns in the lock box, they can lock up medications in their lock box, they can lock things that if a teenager is considering hanging themselves, locking up ligatures and things like that. I've worked with a client, just as an example, where her medications are a risk factor for her. And we have done distancing by having her keep her medications locked up in the glove compartment of her car. And then on once a day, she goes to her car, dispenses the medication that she would be taking, 1 pill at a time every day. But the bulk of the meds are kept distanced from her. So does that make some sense? So if a person is ideating and they are planning, if they don't have access to their means, they're a lot more likely to stay safe. Okay. So there's some really creative things that counselors can do to help individuals remove those lethal means. Okay. Again, a sensitive topic for some individuals, particularly in this region, who pride themselves on their right to own guns. But there are even ways with those individuals who have that type of pride to counsel them in a way so that they know it's temporary, that nobody's trying to take their guns away, nobody's trying to prevent them from hunting, nobody's trying to prevent them from protecting their family and their homes. But temporarily, we've got to distance a person with active suicidal ideation from their means. Questions here? Okay. Some risk factors that we see when we're doing a complete suicide assessment of an individual. If there's a significant amount of stress going on to the point that that person is feeling hopeless. Because the hopelessness, it's one thing to feel really stressed. Like many of you are stressed right now because it's the end of the semester, but the ebb and flow of the academic semester. That pretty soon this, if you're in crunch time right now and under a level of stress, this is going to end sometime soon, okay? Predictably. But if an individual has this hopelessness and they don't see an end in sight, they feel like, this is awful and it's never going to go away. That's when we see oftentimes individuals feel stuck and they start thinking about a means of escape, and oftentimes ideating about suicide as a means of escape. I will add to this, I don't have this on the PowerPoint here, but especially if an individual who is stressed and feeling hopeless feels like they're a burden, particularly a burden to their family, then we're going to see risks increase. Okay. So it's one thing to feel hopeless for yourself, if that makes some sense. It's another thing to feel like you are a burden on others. Okay. If this individual has and this has been a theme all throughout the semester, if this individual has been a victim of physical assault and abuse or sexual assault and abuse, and I want to show you a little bit, I'm moving my picture over here. I want to show you, this is a local study that we conducted, where we've got teenagers in the local rural high schools who completed, it's the Center for Disease Control Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, the YRBS. So it's this survey that the Center for Disease Control designs. We gave it to teenagers in our local rural high schools. And what I've got here is students are divided into if they have been a victim of physical interpersonal violence. Okay, so somebody has beat them up, if they have been a victim of forced sex or rape. And then this both IPVs is if they've both had the physical violence and they've been raped. And then what we've looked at in this, these are the rates of how many more women are reporting that they had been victims of physical interpersonal violence than men. many more women reporting that they had been raped, these teenage high schoolers, and then many more women reporting that they have been victims of both than the men. And then what we did is we looked to see how this predicted suicidal ideation and how this predicted suicidal plan. And this number over here is called a relative risk ratio. And what the number tells you is how many times higher is the risk if these women, as an example, if they were a victim of physical interpersonal violence, their risk of suicidal ideation 2.3 times higher. So more than twice higher if they'd been a victim of physical interpersonal violence. Oops, let me go back. For these women, their risk of suicidal ideation, 3.4 times higher if they had been a victim of rape, but also higher risk for the males here too. If they'd been a victim of both for suicidal ideation, 3.6 times higher, the risk. And then down, sorry. And then down here, suicidal planning. So actually creating a plan, 2.5 times higher if they'd been victims, if they were female and victims of the interpersonal violence, 3 times higher for the males down here if they'd been a victim of physical violence. And then when it came to the rape risk, 2.6 times higher in the females, 2.7 times higher in the males. Okay, so we definitely see being a victim of interpersonal violence being a risk factor for individuals. And there's even research, we've done some of this stuff on my research team, particularly if individuals have not sought professional help. Okay, we see risk being much higher. For individuals who've been victims of interpersonal violence and they've sought professional help, we see their risk much lower. Okay, so again, another place where seeking professional help can be very beneficial for people. Substance abuse does a couple of things in raising suicide risk when we're doing this risk assessment. First of all, when individuals are high, drunk, in some way altered by a substance, they are not clear-headed and making good choices and good decisions. So sometimes the substance use in and of itself creates more impulsivity, okay? Add to that, people who are regularly abusing substances tend to have more chaotic and less stable lives, okay? And so there's a couple of different ways that the substance use can interact there. I did an assessment when an ASU student makes a suicide attempt, before they are allowed to return to school and return to their classes, they usually send them out to have an independent psychiatrist, psychologist do an evaluation of, are they stable enough to be able to attend classes again? And so I did an assessment. I'll give you an example. I had this young man who was sent to me. He had cut himself and made a suicide attempt. And what I found out was that he was actually a very stable young man. He did not have a psychological diagnosis, but he had a girlfriend who eventually he proposed to and was engaged to. So he had a fiance that he was very dependent on. Okay, liked to do everything with her, liked to eat meals with her, stay over and sleep with her, everything social that he did or entertainment wise he wanted to do with her. And over time, she was getting frustrated with his amount of dependency on her. And she wanted more time to be by herself and wanted more time to be with her friends. They get into a really big fight one night because she wants to go out with her girlfriends and have a girls' night. And he either doesn't want her to go or he wants to join them. And she's just like, it's girls' night, dude, like, boyfriend or fiance doesn't belong, that kind of thing. They get into a fight over it. She gets so upset at him. She takes her engagement ring off, she throws it at him, and she leaves. He goes out and gets wasted drunk that night. He's so upset about this potential breakup, and ends up putting his hand through a glass window and cutting himself. So it really wasn't a suicide attempt, if that makes sense. It was actually a drunken accident. So when I'm working with him, he is absolutely willing to not drink at all. And that was the key to getting him back into ASU and back into school. Okay. Because I don't think he would have had that accident and cut himself if it weren't for his alcohol abuse. Okay. And that really wasn't his style. That's not how he rolled anyways. Okay. We also know that LGBTQ individuals, particularly when they are questioning and first starting to come out, particularly if they have come out and they have been rejected by a potential romantic partner, rejected by a family member, rejected by a close friend, that is very high risk. Okay. And a lot of times when we are counseling individuals who are LGBT and they are ready to start coming out, we counsel them on who are the safer people who probably already know that they don't have to be told. They probably already know and kind of suspect this individual's orientation. Okay. Once LGBTQ individuals, though, have outed and they have been accepted, their risk decreases dramatically. We've talked about that social contagion piece. There's even an intervention that they do in school systems nowadays that's called postvention. And postvention would be where an individual, publicly it's known, has died of suicide. They will go into the school system and there's systematic things that they do to get kids talking and processing what happened. And that tends to bring down the contagion rates. Okay, you get much less of that contagion if it is discussed. I can tell you when I was in high school, I did not know the individual who died of suicide very closely, but I do remember even in high school going to a memorial service for this fellow student who had died of suicide. And there was a pastor who got up and said things about this individual, and then there was prayer and that type of thing. But I remember sitting there thinking, because the pastor's describing how these beautiful angels are ascending from heaven and lifting this person's soul up and taking them up to heaven. And I remember sitting in the audience thinking, yeah, that's sweet. That's sweet. And with religious beliefs, that's, what a lot of individuals believe. But I remember sitting there going, you're making this sound very romantic, if that makes sense, right? You're making this sound appealing. If anybody's sitting in the audience and they're suffering, boy, I would like beautiful angels to sweep down and lift me, lift my soul up into heaven too. Does that make some sense? They were making it sound good or romanticized. And it was I just remember even as a teen sitting there going, ugh, I worry about this message for some individuals. We've talked about certainly the depression, the low self-esteem, and the low self-esteem is going to be a little bit more of that permanence, that feeling of like, ooh, if I'm not very good and I'm depressed and I'm not very good and it's never going to get better, then that hopelessness sinks in, particularly again, adding to the hopelessness if there's a sense of being burdensome on others. It's a risk factor if an individual has ever made a parasuicide, which is a suicide attempt. So parasuicide is an attempt that did not result in death. And one of the things that we carefully do as therapists, if there has been a previous parasuicide, we ask in detail questions about that previous parasuicide or suicides, because we want to do an assessment of how lethal was it. Okay. And I'll give you an example. I had a client who made a suicide attempt and took a bunch of antihistamines, so like Benadryl or that type of thing. And I, afterward, when I was kind of assessing how lethal was it, I said, so what happened to you? Did you go unconscious? Did you have to go to the hospital? And she said, no, I never lost consciousness. I just had a really dry sinuses for a few days after overdosing kind of on the antihistamines. That's a very low lethal attempt. Okay. I had another client at one point in time who, however, would have a handgun with one bullet in it. And I think there are, don't quote me on this, I'm not a gun expert, 6 places to put bullets in a handgun, but she would sit on her bed and spin it and play Russian roulette. That's very high lethality. Okay. So we get in there kind of in those previous attempts and we look at how lethal it is, because for a lot of individuals, the more times they attempt, the more lethal it gets and the more likely they are to die. Okay. If there are strained family relationships and during times of breakup, that is a risk factor for individuals. So any questions here? We've covered a lot of different risks. Okay. Okay. I want to show you the Kevin Hines story. So let's go. Let me play this clip of him speaking, and then we could talk a little bit more about his story here.
How are you guys doing at Lakeside today? How are you doing today? I knew you could do that. I'm here at your school to talk to you about mental health issues, bipolar disorder, and preventing suicide. Why me? Well, in my life, I have dealt heavily with all 3 of these subjects, and I'm now a speaker for the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign. I'm going to start here by asking you a question. If you could just by raise of hands answer, that would be great. Did any of you know someone, whether it be a family member, a friend, a colleague, or yourself, who has been diagnosed with a psychological disorder or is suffering from mental health issues? I want you to look around for a moment. That's nearly everybody in this room. Why do you think I came here to talk about this today? Well, don't answer because I'm going to tell you. That's one of those rhetorical questions they do in speeches. I just happen to be one of those young people who in my junior year of high school was diagnosed with a mental disorder. Translation, I have bipolar disorder type 1, and imbalance of chemicals in my brain that affect my judgment and the way I think, act, and feel. I couldn't believe it. Me of all people. I was on the wrestling team, a WCL champion. My football team was the first team to have a winning season in junior varsity in 10 years. How could this stuff be happening to me and why? Yeah, I know 10 years, it's a long time. For crying out loud, I was the football team starting middle linebacker and special teams captain. I was in 6 of the 8 school plays from my freshman to senior year. You get the idea. I was active and integrally involved in the schools I went to. For me, time kept moving forward. I continued to resist my treatment. I continued to take my pills whenever I wanted and not when I was supposed to. And like I said, I drank on psychiatric meds. One of the biggest major mistakes on my part. It hindered any kind of mental growth that I was trying to achieve. Eventually, it became a tremendous learning experience for me. But during those first several years, I resisted. I ended up graduating from high school in June 2000 and enrolled in City College for the next fall. As school and the stress of college got to me, I became close to falling into the deepest depression I had ever experienced. I was cycling into a depth of depression weekly, a depth that I had never understood or seen before. In September 2000, I began to have thoughts of suicide. I was not sleeping, and if you're unaware, constant lack of sleep can lead to psychosis all by itself. Add that to an already mental disorder, and you get chaos. In late September, I wrote a suicide letter to my friend, my family, and my girlfriend at the time. One day later, I attempted to take my own life. I went to the Golden Gate Bridge, and I jumped off. It was a horrifying and traumatic day for my family, my friends, and all of whom I loved. It affected everyone I had ever come into contact in some way, shape, or form. The millisecond I let go of that rail, and the second that I realized I might not ever see this earth again, I didn't want to die. I knew that I had to live, and I hoped and prayed to live to this attempt. Obviously, I did, and I was brought to Marin General Hospital and had to receive emergency surgery for my destroyed back. I had shattered 2 of my lower vertebrae into tiny little pieces, causing extensive injury to my internal organs. During physical rehabilitation, I had to be hospitalized in a psych ward, where I was set to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. Things did not just resume as business as usual. I didn't just get better from there. Between the hospitalization and today, I was sent back to a psychiatric ward 2 more times. 3 stays in 4 years. Like I said, life didn't just turn around and get better. I'd not just move on. It took what was always needed from the get-go, very disciplined, hard work. During hospitalizations, I saw things no teenager or adult should ever see. I felt as though I lost a part of me every single time I went, but I also felt that I gained more. With all that negativity, and as I matured, I realized that this was a much better scenario than an alternative. I was not in jail.
Oops.
I was not in prison. I was simply temporarily put away to get better and to stay better. If I ever needed to go back to a psychiatric ward, I would do it in a heartbeat. It is important for me to get well and stay well, just like it is for all of us. Finally, during the last hospitalization, my medication seemed to stabilize and I became integrally involved with my treatment plan. I made sure that I would not fall off my proverbial treatment wagon ever again. I understood that as a person with bipolar disorder, there were about 101 things I needed to do every day to stay better and to feel good. So I began with little things. I began to discipline my every action. I started a routine that I still follow every day of the week, every week of the month, and every month of the year. There are issues which we can alter and have the ability to change, and there are those which we do not. It was not my choice to develop bipolar disorder. It wasn't even my birth family's choice. But it is my choice to maintain a healthy lifestyle every day of the week. It's my choice to decide how I'm going to cope with having this disease. Now I have made a concerted effort to stay healthy and to work with my treatment, not against it. Talking honestly with my therapist and psychiatrist, exercising regularly, eating well, and maintaining a great sleep pattern have brought me back to a balanced life. I have come to believe in myself and love myself completely. And that's something a lot of people can't say about themselves. But it's possible. I'm here today as a speaker from the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign to encourage each and every one of you in this audience to find a better way of living and taking care of yourself and one another. The next time you see someone obviously having a troubled time, it won't hurt to walk up to them and lend them your ear. Ask them if they're okay, if they need any help. Tell a counselor what you witnessed. I know that it would have helped me a great deal if someone had noticed that in me and made a call on my behalf. Sometimes people who are in such despair, like myself, cannot reach out to others and they need to be reached out to. You can help that student.
Okay, so imagine that. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, and right as he said he let go, he regretted what he had done. Okay, what a horrific fall and moment that must have been for him. But there's a lesson in here. I've heard him speak at other times. He talked about how he took a bus. Didn't have his own car in San Francisco. Public transportation is fantastic out there. Said he was sitting on the bus and he was crying, and that there were people that noticed he was crying, but nobody came up and asked him if he was okay. He said when he got out on the Golden Gate Bridge before he jumped, there was even a couple that asked, this is before selfies, that asked that he take their picture. So he took a picture of a couple and who had obviously been crying, and he took their picture for them and did that favor for them. And he said they didn't ask if he was okay. Got a couple stories to tell you about some of the clinicians at our counseling center. Dr. Denise Lovin, she has now retired, and she and her husband own the Horton Hotel. So she's kind of moved on from her clinical psych practice at the counseling center. She was on campus one day in the campus cafeteria, and she saw a young woman who was sitting at the table and just crying. And so Denise went over and just said, "Are you okay?" And the young woman said, "No, I'm not." And Denise ended up talking with her a little bit and then walking her back to the counseling center. This young woman was crying in the cafeteria, contemplating her own suicide. So it's because Denise asked. Another story at our counseling center, and the lesson here is, if you are concerned, reach out. Another story, Dr. Dan Jones, he's no longer at our counseling center, but he said he was on call one day for walk-in, and a student came in and said, I don't know if you're the right person to tell this to, but out in the parking lot, there's a person sitting in their car and it looks like they've shoved a towel up their tailpipe. So they were trying to die of carbon monoxide asphyxiation, and they go out and they intervene. That person was making an active suicide attempt. And it's because a college student noticed something is suspicious here. I'm just going to walk into the counseling center and just tell people, I don't know what to do about this, but I think something's awry. Okay. Both of those instances, they saved that individual's lives. Okay. Does that make some sense? Okay. Some college suicide facts. We get 10 times more attempts every year, but about 1,000 college students die each year of suicide. And the rate has tripled in the past 25 years for people in your age group. And we talked a little bit about some of these risk factors when we talked about stress this semester, but I do want to emphasize a couple of things. So not only now are we in a pandemic, and if we're being safe, we're more isolated than we were pre-pandemic. That is certainly a newer modern risk factor. But in your particular generation, social media seems like it tends to play a role in isolation. Individuals are posting on social media as opposed to getting together for in-person interactions. And to add to that, we studied a little bit of this on my research team, and we've got another study we're about to launch. It is easier to bully anonymously on social media. And not only is it easier to bully somebody when you're not face to face with them, when you're on some kind of device and doing it, but the bullying gets posted for other people to view. And so it becomes quite public, and that's quite humiliating for the victim of the bullying. And add to the fact that the person who's been the victim of the bullying can go back and revisit the social media over and over and over again. So it's almost as if the victimization can occur over and over and over again. So some very unique factors that you all are, your generation is experiencing, that when I was a younger person, my generation, if you bullied somebody, you would either gossip about them or you'd go bully them on the playground. Like, it happened face to face in most situations. Also add to that, we are doing less living with extended families nowadays. And so there tends to be more of an isolating kind of effect like that. Some of you in here might be, as Thanksgiving comes up, be preparing a Friendsgiving, finding a artificial family. If you are away from extended family or your family of origin, is a really healthy thing that people do nowadays. But again, it used to be that families, like you had your parents and you had your siblings and you lived next door to grandparents or aunts and uncles, and they all kind of helped raise everybody and take care of everybody. And we're seeing less and less of that. Getting a college education, which is an absolute gift. I'm so pleased that you all are college students right now, is a risk factor, because oftentimes what happens is when you get a bachelor's degree, or if you go up and you get a higher professional degree, you go to where the jobs are, as opposed to, say, going back to hometown and finding that job there. So a lot of times a college education sends people away from extended family also. So we've got a lot of different types of risk factors that are happening in your generation. And I can tell you that the American Psychological Association does these stress surveys periodically, and they have found that your generation's age group is reporting more stress now than any previous generation in history that APA has been collecting that data. Add to that, we've talked about guns a bit today, but I do want to talk about mass shootings, because again, when I was growing up, there were people that were killing each other with guns, but you rarely heard about it. And they definitely weren't mass shootings. Okay. Somebody got angry at somebody else and they shot them, that type of thing, or domestic violence. But we did not have mass shootings. Your generation has grown up with that from childhood. Okay. And it is my understanding that that has created an emotional instability for a lot of individuals, particularly if you had to do drills in high school and things like that. So some very unique stressors for your generation. The good news, though, for your generation is there's less stigma, and it seems like young people are more willing to go get professional help nowadays than previous generations that held more stigma and were very stubborn about or very reluctant to reach out for professional help. Okay, so more stress, but more help seeking. So that is good. We also know that suicide rates are higher in a transition time. So transition out of the home into the workforce, transition to first semester in college. Suicide rates are higher in first semester of graduate school or professional school, because those are big transition times. And there's a lot of sort of questioning. Do I know how to do this? Am I going to be able to get through this? Get through this workload? I remember my first semester, I didn't get suicidal, but my first semester in graduate school, I got so overwhelmed with the workload and the amount of reading and the papers that I had to write and all the skills I was learning. And I remember sitting with my research methods journal articles, and the stack was like this high. And I needed to read these articles and be able to know the gist of them so that I could, on an essay exam, report what I learned in those articles. And I was so overwhelmed and I'm crying and I'm dripping tears on the journal articles. And I was having myself my own little pity party. And then it finally occurred to me, Denise, you're wasting time crying. You need to be reading. And then it was like, get my marker out. And it was like, okay, don't waste time crying. Must read, must learn, that kind of thing. And got myself over it. But it took a full semester under my belt to be able to go, okay, this is intense, but I can do it. It was just a step up from undergrad. It was just, different. So it makes sense, transitions like that. Okay, so more on college student suicide. Most who die do so in their residence. So in their dorm room, in their apartment. There is no typical person. It's not like you can necessarily look at somebody and know that they're the kind of person that would likely make an attempt or die of suicide. And most people, this is a hopeful thing, particularly when we start thinking about intervening. Most people who become suicidal, that only tends to happen once in their lives. It's like an all-time low or rock bottom. And for a lot of individuals, kind of knowing that when you are counseling them through that, helping them realize that things can get better over time. ASU has about 40 serious attempts a year, and we on average lose about 2 students a year to suicide. Okay, I have watched each season of 13 Reasons Why. Can I see some head nods for those of you who've watched this? Okay, some of you have not. This is not a spoiler alert, but the whole several seasons starts out where Hannah has died of suicide. And she leaves these tapes. She does these verbal audio recording tapes and discusses the 13 reasons why she chose to die of suicide. And then all of her friends and the other students in the high school are listening to these tapes, listening for clues of why Hannah died of suicide. There is some very disturbing stuff that I found as a psychologist watching this, and there's been a lot of controversy about this show. I can tell you that Dr. Kurt Michael on our faculty was the reason why in the follow-up seasons, 13 Reasons Why posts resources on suicide prevention and how people can reach out for help. He was very disturbed, and like I and many others were, that this show talked about suicide, but it didn't present resources. A real bad thing happened to Hannah. Some other bad things happened to Hannah, but they never showed her as suffering from mental illness, which is highly unusual. Another thing that Hannah did that I found to be quite disturbing is in these audio tapes, placing blame on people, which is very harsh. And then the other thing that I didn't like about the show, and then I'll be done with my rant here, is you see Hannah in every show. Like she's dead, but she's not dead. And for young minds, particularly young minds, if people are using any substances and watching a show like that, that's very confusing. You know, like she's dead, but there she is. You see her because they keep doing flashbacks in every show. And so that gets a little bit kind of confusing, if that makes some sense. So I just wanted to kind of comment on that because that's the modern day version of. The good thing about shows like this, particularly if teenagers watch the show with a parent or guardian, is it creates a nice opportunity to open up discussion about these types of things. But it was my experience with my friends who had tweeners and teens at the time when 13 Reasons Why came out, that kids were getting together and watching this with one another, or they were watching it by themselves. And that, very risky. There's also, this is some of Dr. Kurt Michael's research also, he found that suicide rates increased after this series premiered, and calls to suicide hotlines increased after this premiere. And so it looks like the way that it was first pushed out there without the warnings and all of that kind of stuff. Watch it with your parents. Here are these resources. Here's the phone lines, the text lines for suicide prevention. Created more harm. The show created more harm in the short run than it did any kind of benefit. Okay, I want you to know about our counseling center and the phone number. It's over by the health center. I also want you to know that students can call campus security 24/7 and can get some help if they, yourself, if you are distressed and feel like you're at risk, or if you know of somebody that is distressed and at risk. Also, this didn't exist when I first got here in Boone, and now it does exist, and I'm very pleased about this. Our emergency department at Watauga Medical Center now has a 24/7 crisis team. So they have mental health professionals that are there all the time. So if there is a mental health crisis, a person can go through Watauga's ER and they can get assessed, and they are usually triaged in some way. So assessed and either hospitalized in a psych hospital. Sometimes they are assessed and they create a safety plan, and they're able to discharge them and send them back out. They link individuals to psychiatry resources, psychology, and other behavioral resources. So it's great to know that we've got this 24-hour crisis team. Okay. We also have a full-time suicide prevention counselor employed at ASU. So not only the faculty at the counseling center, but through the Dean of Students office. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about intervention. If you know somebody who might be actively thinking about suicide, how to get in there, reach out, and be helpful. So first of all, recognizing clues. So if an individual has been depressed or has been cycling through depression and mania and bipolar, individuals who seem hopeless or helpless, individuals who are using language as if they are a burden, like nobody would care if I left this earth, individuals who are giving away possessions. Okay, that is a behavioral sign. Individuals who stop grooming, okay, who stop showering, stop getting dressed for their day. A young woman who normally would wear makeup stops putting on makeup, as an example. So recognizing those clues. And then if you have concern, trust your own judgment. I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I was in college. So I was a resident advisor, and we had a gal on my hall that several of the other residents and I were concerned about. And I had met with this particular gal, I'm going to call her Beth, and I had sat down and I had made a referral to the counseling center for Beth at the time. And I didn't know if she went to the counseling center or not. She did not have many friends on the hall, in my residence hall. And then one night, a bunch of the gals decided to go out to a party and have a girls' night type of thing. And they convinced Beth to go with them. They were like, okay, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to get her out, cheer her up, that type of thing. Late that night, somewhere midnight-ish or whatnot, one of the gals comes knocking on my door and says, Beth got really drunk at the party and she's passed out. So I go down the hall, and indeed, we were not able to wake her up. So we're trying to wake her up. We can't wake her up. We get the smelling salts out and we put those under, and we can't wake her up. And I'm getting more and more concerned. Like my stomach is sinking, like, whoa, this is not good, because normally you could, just kind of wake somebody up. At that point in time, I decided to call 911. And interestingly, when I'm about ready to call 911, the gals that came and woke me up and got me involved were like, oh, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. But it was at that point that, well, I knew, they didn't know, that I had made that referral to her for the counseling center. Okay. And then here she is, passed out drunk. We can't wake her up. And then you all know there's the asphyxiation risk that if a person vomits and then they breathe in some of that particulate and it clogs their windpipe, they can die of asphyxiation. Okay. So again, they're trying to talk me out of making this call at this point. And I just kind of put on my big girl underwear and I'm like, no, we're going to call 911. I am so glad we did, because what the doctor said is she would have died that night of alcohol poisoning if we had not made that call. Okay. But again, in peer pressure, they tried to talk me out of it. Okay. And that's why I say, if you are concerned, listen to your gut and don't necessarily listen to the peer pressure, because a lot of time with the peer pressure, it's this idea, oh, they'll sleep it off. Well, what if they die of alcohol poisoning like she would have? What if they vomit and they asphyxiate and die because of that? Okay. It's too heavy to not react. Okay. And that is my advice there. There's even an ad now for stroke. They're doing the same kind of thing. They're even saying overreact, because a lot of times in those situations, we get this pressure to not overreact when it's actually the correct action to take. Okay. Tell others. A lot of time, an individual who is desperate and suicidal sitting in front of you will ask that you keep it confidential. Like, you can't tell anybody this, or I want you to keep it confidential. And here's what I say to anybody out there who is not a psychiatrist or is not a licensed psychologist. You have no obligation to keep anything confidential. You don't. Like if I had a client in front of me, because I'm a licensed psychologist, I have to keep what they tell me confidential professionally and not go telling friends and family what I know about them. But just don't promise it. And you can say, we need to get a professional involved. And in the quickest way of doing that would be if you were sitting with somebody who is suicidal, calling campus security or calling local police and getting them over there. Okay. They know what they're doing once they come through your doors. Okay. And they're always on call. They're always there. And if somebody needs, as an example, if somebody needs transportation to the local ER, they can take you, or take a friend, or take somebody else. Okay. So that's an easy way of being able to do that. So getting other professionals involved. Stay with the person. Do not leave them alone. And again, that's why you're going to want to get a professional involved, because you can't stay with somebody indefinitely forever and protect them forever. And that is quite a heavy burden to ask of somebody who's trying to intervene. Okay. So stay with that person until professional help arrives, or you can get that person to professional help. 8 to 5, our counseling center on campus. I have done this many a times where I've just walked a student. I've had a student come to my office and share information where I know they need professional help, and I will walk them over to the counseling center. and make sure that they are in good hands before I let go of them. You want to listen and encourage talking. And one of the places where a lot of times a good friend or an acquaintance or a roommate can get into trouble is trying to cheer somebody up. So as an example, let's say this person in front of you who is suicidal says, you know, I'm a terrible student and I'm a horrible friend. I'll never amount to anything. Our instinct is to get in there and go, no, you're not, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. And to that person, at least in that desperate moment, they're feeling like they're not being heard. Okay. So even if you don't agree with what somebody's saying, just sort of listening and acknowledging that I'm hearing you kind of thing. Professional help, the pressure's okay. And again, you want to get them in hands where people know what they're doing. Be supportive, show them that you care, whatever that might be. You know, if you're going to the hospital, can I bring you, let me know if you need clean clothes. Let me know if you need for me to take care of your cat. Let me know if you want me to call your parents for you, that type of thing. So any different ways of, all those different ways of being able to be supportive. Okay. Questions, comments before we close out the semester? I know we've covered some heavy material today. I do have one appointment this afternoon in my office hours, but do know if any of you want to kind of come into my Zoom room, pop in and process some of the stuff that we've talked about today, feel free. I'll be there from 2 to 4. Any questions? All right, it's good to see everybody. Thank you for being a part of my synchronous class. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Martz.
Bye.